When the war began in February 2022, Russia banked on a victory that would take mere weeks. Instead, we're closing out the fourth year of a conflict that shows no signs of stopping. With both sides trapped in a war of attrition, 2026 looms as a critical turning point, the year when the true cost of Vladimir Putin's strategic failure is likely to fully destabilize Russia. The warning signs are everywhere. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stated in October that Russia is running out of money, troops, and ideas. But this isn't just Western optimism talking. The hard data from the battlefield, Russia's own economic indicators, and the Kremlin's increasingly desperate measures all point to the same conclusion. Russia is eating itself alive to sustain this war, and 2026 may be the year when there's simply nothing left to consume. Let's examine exactly why 2026 is shaping up to be Russia's worst year ever, and why Putin's war machine may finally grind to a halt, starting with its military equipment. Russia began this war with one of the world's largest arsenals. Thousands of tanks sat in storage facilities across the country, many of them leftovers from the Soviet Union's massive military-industrial complex. On paper, Russia looked unstoppable. But while the saying, "quantity has a quality all its own," may have merit, it turns out that quantity is rusting, outdated, and impossible to maintain. According to Oryx, which meticulously tracks visually confirmed equipment losses, Russia has lost over 23,400 units of military equipment through October 2025. Of these, roughly 13,600 are armored vehicles, including 4,211 tanks destroyed or damaged in just 43 months of fighting. And remember, these are only the losses that were visually confirmed through satellite imagery, drone footage, and independent sources. The actual numbers are almost certainly higher, with analysts suggesting visual confirmation captures between 80 and 90% of total losses. But the tanks being lost now are also far better than what's coming out of storage to replace them. Russia started the war with approximately 3,300 modern tanks in active service, including upgraded T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. The country also had somewhere between 5,000 and 17,500 older Soviet-era tanks in storage, though the actual condition of these vehicles was always questionable. More importantly, Russia has been pulling these older tanks out of storage at an accelerating rate. By May 2022, just 3 months into the invasion, Soviet-era T-62 started appearing on the battlefield. By November 2024, Russia had resorted to deploying T-34 tanks, which were relics from World War II used primarily for military parades. The production numbers are even worse. Russia can manufacture approximately 400 modern tanks per year, namely T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. Over the 42 months of war through mid-2025, that adds up to roughly 875 new tanks. But Russia has lost well over 3,000 of these tanks. Even accounting for tanks pulled from storage and refurbished, the math simply doesn't work. Russia is burning through its tank inventory at a rate that far exceeds its ability to replace them. And the replacement capacity is actually getting worse, not better. Russia's ability to refurbish stored tanks has declined dramatically from over 120 tanks per month at the beginning of 2022 to just 35 per month by mid-2025. The reason is simple. Russia took the best tanks out of storage first. What remains are increasingly decrepit vehicles that require more work, more parts, and more time to make battlefield ready. Many are simply beyond repair. The International Institute for Strategic Studies delivered a devastating assessment in their 2025 report. Russia will not have sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 if it maintains the same operational tempo and suffers the same losses as in 2024. And tanks are just the beginning of Russia's equipment crisis. Russia's artillery situation is, if anything, even more humiliating. According to a Reuters analysis, North Korea is now supplying up to 100% of Russian artillery shells used in Ukraine. The supposed second most powerful military in the world is entirely dependent on ammunition from one of the most isolated and impoverished nations on Earth. North Korea has sent containers to Russia that could hold between 4 and 6 million artillery shells over the course of a year and a half. Russia's domestic production, by comparison, reached approximately 2.3 million shells in 2024, and that's short of its target of 3 million. Meanwhile, Russian forces are using approximately 10,000 shells per day, which works out to 3.65 million shells annually. Even with North Korean imports, Russia is barely keeping pace with its consumption rate. But here's the truly pathetic part. Some reports suggest approximately half of the North Korean shells don't even work. These munitions were manufactured in the 1970s and 1980s, pulled from old stockpiles with minimal inspection. Russia has to perform additional quality control checks before use, a process that its already strained military-industrial complex can barely handle. Russia's response to this ammunition crisis is equally telling. According to leaked documents, Moscow is rushing to complete a new TNT and RDX explosives production facility in Siberia, located some 1,800 miles east of Moscow. It's as far away from the front line as possible, just in case Ukraine gets even better at long-range strikes. The situation in Russian aviation is equally catastrophic. In 2022, shortly after the invasion began, the Russian government announced plans to procure more than 1,000 new civil aircraft by 2030. By early 2025, Russian factories had produced exactly 5. These production targets were quietly slashed, and defense spending on aircraft production was reduced due to so-called ongoing delays in manufacturing challenges. Military aviation faces similar problems. A 2024 RAND Corporation report estimated that the Russian Air Force was operating at less than 75% of its pre-war capacity. Russian aircraft initially flew over 150 sorties per day, pushing older airframes far beyond their intended operational limits. RAND estimated that Russia was actively losing approximately 60 aircraft per year just from overuse and lack of proper maintenance. Russia's military-industrial complex can only produce 26 new military aircraft annually, including just 14 fighter jets. The civilian and military aviation crises are interconnected. Both industries rely on the same spare parts, maintenance facilities, and engineering expertise. Western sanctions have cut off access to critical components, while the engineering talent needed to maintain aircraft is either dying in the war or fleeing the country. Russia has been trying to replace Western civilian aircraft with domestically produced alternatives, but the numbers show this effort is failing catastrophically. Then there are Russia's air defense systems, the S-300 and S-400 platforms that were supposed to be the pinnacle of Russian military technology. Over 30 S-300 and S-400 launchers and radars have been visually confirmed as destroyed by Ukraine since the start of the war, with a total of 340 surface-to-air missile systems lost. Even more embarrassingly, Israel reportedly dismantled all 4 S-300 systems that Russia sold to Iran with seeming ease, showing the limitations of these supposedly advanced weapons against Western military technology. The equipment situation has gotten so dire that Russia has had to pull S-300 systems from Kaliningrad. Russia is literally leaving its most vulnerable territories exposed because it doesn't have enough equipment to defend both the front lines and its own borders. As we head into 2026, Russia will likely see its equipment losses accelerating, its production capacity declining, and its stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment possibly exhausted. If Russia's equipment situation is catastrophic, its manpower crisis is potentially civilization-ending. Western estimates suggest that Russia has suffered over 1 million total casualties, killed and wounded combined, since February 2022. By mid-October 2025, casualties had grown by almost 60% in a single year, reaching somewhere between 984,000 and 1,438,000 total. The correct number is likely closer to the higher end of that estimate. The dead alone number between 190,000 and 480,000. And yet, over the summer of 2025, Putin's armies failed to capture a single large city despite these horrific losses. To put this in perspective, the Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted a decade and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, resulted in approximately 15,000 to 25,000 Soviet deaths. The current war in Ukraine has potentially exceeded the death toll by a factor of 10 to 20 in less than half the time. But the casualty figures don't capture the full scope of Russia's demographic catastrophe. Russia's fertility rate crashed to between 1.2 and 1.4 during the economic chaos of the 1990s following the Soviet Union's collapse. It recovered somewhat to around 1.8 by the 2010s, but this is still well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman needed to maintain a stable population. This means Russia was already facing a demographic crisis before the war began, with a shortage of young men in the prime military and working age. Now, the war is compounding this crisis exponentially. Between 190,000 and 480,000 young men are dead. Another 800,000 or more are severely wounded, many permanently disabled. And these are the same men who should be starting families, entering the workforce and building Russia's economic future. An entire generation of Russian men either doesn't exist or is being systematically exterminated in Ukraine. The consequences of this demographic devastation will echo through Russian society for decades. These are missing soldiers, workers who will never contribute to the economy, and taxpayers who will never fund Russia's social programs. The demographic hole Russia is creating will take generations to